Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I have the great pleasure, honor of now interviewing Jens Stoltenberg, who was until very recently the Secretary General of NATO, is now moving to a very prestigious role heading up the Munich Security Conference. I've actually spent time with Secretary General Stoltenberg on quite a few occasions. I've interviewed him. Many of my colleagues have interviewed him many, many times. I have to say, Jens, that you are known as the most on-message man on the world stage, that you were never ruffled by a question, you were always on message, you are the perfect NATO Secretary General because whatever journalists threw at you, you had exactly the talking points. So I have very, very high expectations now that you're no longer the Secretary of NATO and you don't have to be so diplomatic. I expect you to be very, very forthcoming, and I am very pleased to say that your team told me to ask you very hard questions. And they also told me to interrupt you if you go on and talk for too long. So get ready, because that's what it's going to be like. And I will interrupt you and keep you rolling. We only have about 20 minutes, so I want to make sure we get through a bunch of questions. I'm sure the audience is just as eager to hear from you now that you are unleashed and able to say whatever you want. So I'm going to start with a softball. How hard was it doing that job? Because I remember so many times you looking very sad and very kind of like, a little bit like Stalin, who would always, he would always resign, and then they would say, no, no, Stalin, you can't leave. You're too important to us, to the nation. And there was a little bit like that with NATO. You would, 5 years in, you're like, I'm ready to leave, I'm resigning. And they say, no, 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 we can't do it without you. What was it like doing that job? And what was it like being asked to carry on and carry on and carry on, long beyond what you thought you were going to do in the beginning?
So first, Jamil, it's great to see you. Great to attend this Santander conference. But let me start by also expressing my deepest condolences and sympathy to Spain and to all the victims of the flooding. Then I don't know whether that comparison with Stalin is a compliment or not. What I can say is that it was demanding. It was a hard job to be Secretary General of NATO for 10 years, but it was also extremely meaningful. So therefore, I really mean it when I say it was a great privilege to serve at the helm of NATO, to work with 32 allies, and to ensure that we actually stepped up and not least supported Ukraine. So it's right to leave, and I don't miss myself. NATO has an excellent Secretary General now with Mark Rutte, but I'm a privileged man who has been able to serve for 10 years at NATO.
And what could you say now that you wish you could have said then, when you were running NATO?
You know, I have always been a careful man, also before I was elected as Secretary General of NATO, and I actually plan to continue to be a bit careful, partly also because I'm going to take up the job as chair of the Munich Security Forum, and that also gives me some responsibility. So, you know, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose, meaning that if I just spoke freely, I would have no impact, or very likely no impact at all. But I think what I can say is that we could have started to support Ukraine much earlier. And if you ask me what could I have said earlier and more clearly while I was in position, was that, of course, if we had supported Ukraine more after 2014, because the war didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014, with only a fraction of the military support we have given after the full-scale invasion in 2022, it may be that we have been able to prevent the invasion, to prevent war. So it demonstrates how arming a country, how deterrence actually is a way to preserve peace, and that could have been the case in Ukraine.
So Vladimir Putin and apologists in the West for Vladimir Putin would say, or do say, that it was NATO expansion that caused the Ukraine war, that was the trigger, that if NATO had stuck with what America had promised, supposedly, although that's apparently not true, but that it wouldn't expand eastward, that this would have never happened. What do you say to that?
First, I say that NATO has never threatened Russia, and Ukraine has never threatened Russia. Second, the idea that in a way NATO expansion is the reason for the war is very dangerous. Partly because it's not NATO in a kind of aggressively way going eastwards. It's the countries that obtained freedom after the end of the Cold War. The Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, all these countries, they chose through democratic free processes to apply for membership and join NATO. And the fact that sovereign nations make sovereign democratic decisions and to call that a threat against the neighbor Russia is a very dangerous thought. That Latvia, in a way, decides, or Lithuania decides that we want to be part of NATO, that gives Russia the right to invade or to deny them that right is extremely dangerous. And I say that also because I come from Norway. When NATO was established in 1949, Norway was the only country bordering the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin in Moscow said that was a provocation that Norway joined NATO bordering the Soviet Union. But Washington, London, Paris, these countries that were key in establishing NATO, they said if Norway wants, of course they had the freedom to join. So we can never accept that free democratic decisions by independent countries gives another country, Russia, the right to invade and to deny them the right to choose their own path.
That's a very interesting thing that brings me to my next question. Do you believe that only democracies, proper democracies, should be allowed to be part of the NATO club?
Democracy is one of NATO's core values, and I have used much of my time to advocate for the importance of democracy in the big world, but also, of course, inside NATO, that we uphold those values. But of course, I know that not all allies have always been able to live up to those values. When NATO was established, Spain was not invited because Spain was a dictatorship under General Franco. But Portugal was invited. And Portugal was not a democracy either in 1949. It was actually a dictatorship. And the reason why Portugal was invited was that the strategic importance of the Azores, the Atlantic islands were so important that actually they decided that was more crucial for the alliance than the level of democracy in Portugal. This is an historic example, but it demonstrates that actually NATO has struggled with that dilemma, also defending against outward threats, but at the same time trying to live up to the core values of democracy. It's nothing new in our alliance.
Which brings me to Turkey. Let's talk about Turkey. Turkey recently asked to join the BRICS, and surely that must disqualify Turkey from being a NATO member. But is it just too strategic, given its geographic location and its positioning in the Middle East? Surely, asking to join BRICS is like the definition of wanting to leave NATO, surely.
Well, first of all, to attend the BRICS meetings doesn't mean that you agree with President Putin. There were many countries participating in that meeting a week ago, and they disagree on many issues, including the war in Ukraine, where Turkey, but also India, other countries that participated in the meeting, have condemned clearly in different UN resolutions the illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine. Second, what matters for me is that Turkey is an important part of NATO's collective defense. You can just look at the map. They are bordering Russia in the Black Sea, but they're also bordering Iraq and Syria. And our fight against ISIS, especially from 2014 and in the following years, that fight was very much dependent on using infrastructure, the bases in Turkey. So Turkey supports NATO. There are concerns among some allies about freedom of expression, the right for journalists to work in a free way. And I have encouraged allies to raise those concerns using NATO as a platform, but it doesn't change the importance of Turkey being a NATO ally.
In 1954, the Soviet Union proposed joining NATO. Do you think there could ever be a day where Russia would be allowed to join NATO?
It doesn't look very likely today, but we need to remember that.
I'm looking for a headline. Yes, come on. No.
Yeah.
Carry on.
That history is full of examples of adversaries that actually become close friends. So, in one time in the future, of course, that can be possible. If you look at Europe, you see countries like France and Germany. They used to be in war with each other for centuries. Now they are the best friends and allies, both in the European Union and in NATO. Britain fought Germany, France for many years. Now they are allies in NATO. In the Nordic region, where I'm from, Norwegians and Danes and Swedes used to kill each other in many Nordic wars. It's totally over. So of course it's not written in stone that we forever must have a difficult, bad adversary relationship with Russia. Of course we can build trust in the future, even though it looks quite bleak now.
So we have a new acronym. I think we coined it at Politico, but we probably stole it and then coined it. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the CRINC, as we're calling them. The CRINC, how serious is an alliance of these countries? You know, have North Korean soldiers allegedly or supposedly now fighting in the Kursk region against Ukraine. China supplying at least all the components needed for Russia to run its war machine. How serious is this alliance? What do you, when you see this alliance, how worried are you about it?
No, that's very serious, and it demonstrates how authoritarian powers are more and more aligned, how Russia and China are more and more aligned, and how Russia is receiving support from North Korea, Iran, but also China propping up the Russian war economy. As I said, more than 90% of the microelectronics Russia is using to build their bombs, the missiles they use against Ukraine, they receive from China. Thousands of drones, ammunition from Iran, from North Korea, and now also more than 10,000 soldiers on their way to the front lines in Ukraine. So the more aligned these authoritarian powers are, the more important it is that we are aligned in NATO, North America and Europe, but also working closely with partners around the world, including South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others. So this is extremely serious, and it also demonstrates that security is not regional. It's not a European security and then a Asian security. It's a global security. What happens in Asia matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Asia, and the war in Ukraine really demonstrates that.
I'd just like to thank you for mentioning little New Zealand, where I grew up, in that long list of much more important countries. Yes, I think it was Henry Kissinger described New Zealand as the dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, which makes us incredibly important strategically as little Kiwis. Are you worried, what you just said there about global, you know, when you listen to the Chinese, you listen to others in the world, they say that's mission creep. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's got nothing to do with China or Asia. So are you worried about mission creep for NATO?
So first, it's not for me to speak on behalf of NATO anymore, but I'm confident that NATO will remain a regional alliance. It's actually in the treaty that NATO is for European countries and Canada and the United States. So by definition, NATO will remain a regional alliance. But this transatlantic region faces global threats. And that has been the case for many years. International terrorism is global. Cyber is global. Space is by nature global, and space is more and more weaponized. And then the war in Ukraine demonstrates how Iran, North Korea, and China are enabling Russia to fight the biggest war in Europe we have seen since the Second World War. So, of course, the transatlantic region has to deal with global threats and also then work with global partners, including New Zealand, in addressing them together with other democratic nations.
I can see the headlines in Wellington tomorrow. It's great. I'm very happy. You've been quite a big advocate of tackling climate change, and I want to challenge you a little bit on this. Is there really a link between hard defense needs and climate action, or should soldiers really focus on fighting and winning wars? Because I can tell you that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are not worrying about their carbon footprint when they think about invading their neighbors or actually invade their neighbors. So do you really think there is a connection between military goals and climate change goals, tackling climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the big achievements we actually made at the very successful NATO summit in Madrid not so many years ago, where we agreed a new strategic concept for the alliance, the Madrid strategic concept, where we clearly defined that climate change matters for our security. Partly because climate change is a crisis multiplier. It increases competition of scarce resources, water, land, and will force millions of people to move. So it multiplies crisis. Second, our soldiers, they operate out there in more and more extreme weather conditions, and the uniform, the equipment, the planes, the ships have to adapt to more extreme weather conditions. Thirdly, and most importantly, is of course that if we really want to reach a global net zero of emissions of greenhouse gases, we also need to find ways to reduce emissions from military activity, which is quite substantial with the planes, with the ships, with all the other things that we do as militaries in the alliance and in the wider world. And I believe that in the long run, it will not be a contradiction between either green, environmentally friendly, or effective military capabilities. I strongly believe that in the future, the most effective engines, the most effective vehicles will also be environmentally friendly, as you now see with, for instance, development of electric cars and electric engines. So it's about NATO and allies keeping the technological edge by also then implementing more climate-friendly technologies in their armed forces.
So the obvious question that any journalist would ask you next is, can NATO survive Trump? But I want to turn that around a little bit. And I want to say, is it possible, in your opinion, that the shock that Donald Trump might provide if he is elected next week is exactly what NATO needs? Because the danger is more that we get President Harris and then it's business as usual and everyone goes back to relying on America, a weakening America, let's be honest, a diminished and probably over the long term, somewhat diminishing America, and relies on that for collective defense rather than standing up and paying its own way. So could Trump be just the ticket that NATO needs to fix itself?
I expect that regardless of who is elected as president in the United States, the United States will remain a committed NATO ally. We don't have any guarantees in democracies, but that's what I expect, because it is in the security interest of the United States to have a strong NATO. In NATO, the United States has something no other major power has, and that is more than 30 friends and allies. Russia doesn't have that, China doesn't have that, and of course the United States is big. It's 25% of world GDP. But together with NATO allies, we are 50% of the world's GDP and 50% of the world's military might. So I strongly believe that it is in the interest of the United States to remain in NATO. And there's one other thing, and that is that if you listen carefully to what former President Trump says, and I worked with him, and I had actually a good working relationship with him for 4 years, the criticism is not primarily against NATO. It's against NATO allies not paying enough for NATO. And the good news is that we made a decision in 2014 to increase defense spending to 2%. Allies have delivered on that. Now we went from 3 in 2014 to 23 allies meeting the 2% target. And that's also something they have noticed very so clearly in Washington, both the Republicans and the Democrats.
So this is a banking conference, and the theme is growth. And not everybody knows you're actually an economist. So I wanted to ask you about what you think here in Europe in particular are the main obstacles to growth, but also maybe we were talking a lot about the capital markets union, banking union. What do you think are the biggest challenges for Europe to be a healthy engine of growth in the world?
Yeah. So first, I'll be very careful to start to, tell a conference of economists and banking people how to, in a way, organize their economies in the best possible way. I have been Minister of Finance, I've been Prime Minister in Norway, I'm an economist, but that was actually a decade ago when I worked with domestic Norwegian politics. There are a couple of things I would like to say despite that. One is, of course, that we need to preserve peace. Because without peace, we cannot have prosperity. So therefore, actually investing in our security is a precondition for economic growth. Geopolitics matters much more for our economies now than perhaps you were aware of just a couple of decades ago. Second, I believe that the Draghi report has many good observations and recommendations. Investments are important. And something I've seen from the defense sector, but also that applies for many other of the European industrial sectors, including the financial sector, is fragmentation. So whatever we can do as Europeans, as the European Union, to overcome fragmentation will be extremely helpful also to stimulate economic growth. And one of the things I'm actually quite proud of that we managed during my tenure was to strengthen very much the cooperation between the European Union and NATO. Overcoming fragmentation of the European economies is, I think, the key.
We're out of time, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Without thinking, answer me, are we in the historical parallel in the period before World War II or before World War I? Go, answer. Pre-World War I or pre-World War II?
We can prevent war. So if you're asking me whether we are destined for war, as we were before the First and the Second World War, we can prevent war, but then we need to stand together and we need to send a clear message to Moscow and to any other potential adversary that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. As long as that's credible, no one will attack us because we are by far the strongest military power in the world.
Jens Stoltenberg, I'll see you in February in Munich. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you, the most on-message man on the world stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you mind taking that? Yeah.